Very good. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first meeting in the year 2025. We will call the meeting to order. At this time, it is 6:33. Please mute your microphones unless you are speaking. Any guest in attendance should introduce themselves in the chat, listing their organization affiliation, if any, and providing their contact information. To ensure that we have adequate time to hear from all commissioners, guests are asked not to speak during ACP meetings with the exception of invited speakers, though you are welcome, and I would say encouraged to add your thoughts in the comments in the chat. At this time, can we have an approval of our December minutes? Can we get a motion? Or are there any questions?
We approve the minutes from December.
Thank you, Cherie. Do we have a second?
Second.
I second.
All right. Who was the first second? Was that you, C. Arthur?
Francisco.
Francisco.
John
Okay, very
Stevenson.
good.
I said, well, I'm here too.
Okay, thanks, John. All right, it's been moved and seconded that we receive and accept the minutes from the December meeting. All in favor, say aye. Or raise your hands. Any opposition? All right, very good. Susan, do we have a new council member attending today?
We do. It's Mr. Henry Mulzak, if I pronounced your last name correctly, I hope.
Henry?
Well, he was here. Where is he?
Yes, you have pronounced
okay.
it correctly. I've just unmuted myself. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
All right, welcome, Henry. All right, so let's proceed with our agenda. First, for discussion tonight, we return to Bill 2624E. That's the U visa law enforcement certification policy. And thank you, Francisco, for sending out the summary report and resending it for tonight's meeting. And so I want to pivot to you to just, if you would like to summarize or discuss any high points from what you sent us, and then we can continue our discussion in preparation for a vote.
Well, as you probably, just to summarize the report and what's in the letter, we looked into the law as it's written and as it's implemented. We met with Captain Satinsky at MCPD, and then we talked with both Susan and with the lawyer who drafted the bill, the council's bill. In looking at it, we don't find any objections except that with what the bill calls for, except that we want to make sure that the MCPD is in a position to and is allowed to reject most applications that relate to a crime that has taken place, that has been committed outside of Montgomery County. Because except in very rare circumstances, there's no way that MCPD would be able to certify, provide the certification of helpfulness. And so, except in those rare exceptions that are allowed by law, and those tend to be, it's an emergency at the request of a law enforcement officer from another agency, as part of a joint investigation or a task force, unless it was in one of those cases, very rare exceptions, there's no way that MCPD would be able to certify. And so those requests would be better. It would be better for both the applicant and for MCPD to send those requests in to the law enforcement agency that has jurisdiction over where the crime has taken place. As far as the four the requirements that are now in the current policy, that go beyond what is required by law. We didn't see any real need for any of those requirements, with the exception of that the crime be committed in Montgomery County. So we think that we should generally be supportive, and the letter basically lays that out. If you have any questions, be glad to answer. Yes, Cherie?
Yeah, so just to clarify for everybody, this policy affects people who are witnesses or victims.
Well, so the law requires that the individual applying for the bill either be a victim or a witness
Right.
who has suffered because of the crime. So that person could be a relative, or that person could be someone who suffered physical or mental trauma in witnessing the crime.
So, but MCD policy only covers which? Either a victim or a witness.
MCPD policy doesn't specify. So I don't think that's an issue in the sense that, as I'm just rereading the policy.
Yeah, I think what I read, and it's been a while, was that MCPD covered victims, because I
Right.
remember emailing you and asking, well, does this cover witnesses? I mean, so
Okay.
that's, and to me, that's the disconnect, right? That that someone who is a witness and who has cooperated substantially should also be covered, and the federal law allows that, but it seems that the MCD policy has narrowed that. And so what I'm suggesting is that you could be a witness to a crime in Fairfax, but you could live in Montgomery County, and you could still be in some, there could be some danger. So what I'm suggesting is that that in addition that we add a sentence, if you will, to the letter that that ask MCPD to extend their current policy to witnesses.
Who qualify under federal law, because they're
Exactly, because people, if we're talking about community engagement and people being willing to come forward and all that kind of stuff, then it's not just the people who have been victimized, it's also the people who may have seen it. They could be very helpful.
Yeah, no, and you're right, but and just so that to clarify, and when I replied to your question in the email, in effect, it's very difficult for witnesses to qualify for a U visa because of the requirement of demonstrating that they have suffered substantial physical or mental abuse, and so. But I think that makes sense to me, and I have no problem adding the sentence.
Yeah, I mean, if we're really talking about, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the work you all have done, because as I said when we first got this, immigration is really an area of law that is not easy. But I really think it would make sense for us to encourage essentially that witnesses, I think we want to encourage witnesses to come forward, and if this could be sort of the carrot for them, I think that would be helpful to all of us.
Mm-hmm. No, I see no problem with that. It makes sense. Any others?
Francisco, I have a question.
Sure.
So what is the fundamental thing that is driving this change? What are we trying to achieve through this bill, and what is the reason why we came up with this thing?
So the the council wanted to make sure that in anticipation of the coming administration, that we did everything possible uh, um, to ensure that Montgomery County is a welcoming place for immigrants. And apparently, if I understand it correctly, there was a case of an individual who wanted to apply for a U visa, and it was they found out that the policy, because the crime took place in 2004, the policy would not allow him to apply for the certificate of helpfulness. And so that's when they started looking at the requirements of that the MCPD policy had, and said, well, does this make sense? And my understanding is that certainly the requirement of 10 years for a felony is, it's not necessary anymore, because since the requirement was established, or when the requirement was established, all of the data that MCPD had was paper driven, and now they have made progress in automating some of that data, and so therefore they can go ahead and search, and they may still be unable to certify, but at least now they have more capability to do the search, look for the records, and see if there is and if they can certify.
I see. So let's say if the crime is committed like 10 years ago, do we still have evidence related to the crime?
This has nothing, well, the only thing that MCPD is required to do is the person who has been a victim or a witness is to certify that in fact the person was the victim or a witness,
okay,
and that they were helpful in the investigation or in just reporting the incident. And whatever MCPD considers helpful, then they can make the certification and then send it forward. The certification then is sent to the applicant, and then the applicant attaches that certification to the application for a U visa that goes to USCIS, and it's USCIS that makes the determination based on all of the documentation provided whether the person qualifies for a visa or not.
okay. And I'm understanding that most of the cases are approved, right? If you have a U visa, 90%.
Yes and no. So you're right. MCPD tells us that they approve basically 90% of the requests, and that's probably because the U visa process is, I guess, so difficult that almost all the applicants do so with the help of a lawyer.
I see.
And so, basically MCPD has this administrative role of saying, we can certify that the person was helpful or not. Then when it goes to USCIS, it's also a very high rate of approval. The problem is that one, Congress has limited the issuance to, I forget now, I think it's 10,000 visas a year. And so there's an administrative backlog. So the visas, right now there's a backlog of about 300,000, over 300,000 applications.
I see. Okay. And how does the MCPD view this bill? Or are they in favor? Have we got any opinion from their side?
Well, we talked with Captain Satinsky, and maybe he can let us know right now. We know
I
that-
can't comment on pending Hi, Sonny. I'm sorry. I can't comment on pending legislation. That's
Okay.
not for me.
I
That's
see.
I work for
Yeah.
the executive branch, so that would be the county executive's office.
Right.
I
The
see.
only thing I will note is that when this this bill was announced publicly, there was a press conference, and the MCPD chief was there and seemed very supportive in his comments. So it seemed very welcoming of the bill. So I can tell you that much.
Thank you.
Can I
Yeah.
say one thing here? I know one of you was asking about what brought this bill on, what brought the background. So I'm looking at, which I took out before I got on Zoom here, and because I wanted to have the background to make sure that people understand what brought this bill up here in. So in the background, I'm just going to read it so people understand why Montgomery County is bringing up this bill here. It says Congress created the U visa in 2000 to allow non-citizens who are victims of certain crimes or who cooperate with investigators and prosecution of such crime to temporarily remain and work in the United States. So it is my understanding, reason they want this bill to go, came up with this bill in Montgomery County Council, is because the federal bill, Montgomery policy has some restrictions on those particular things, and it is to open up, to cover all the things and not restrict anything greater than what the Congress bill that they created. So to answer the question earlier, yes, we should people who cooperate with investigation or prosecution are covered under the new bill or bill to deal with the policy, that make the policy clear of what the Montgomery County Police can do.
If I remember correctly, part of the issue, you mentioned the restrictions, part of the issue with MCD policy was that it had a time limited restriction, and it like, how many years ago could it be?
10 years,
Yeah.
10 years.
Yeah,
It was 10.
right. And so there's no, as I understand it, the federal law does not necessarily have that same time limit restriction.
Exactly.
And that's
sorry,
one of the
exactly.
things that this bill would
Eliminate.
would make uniform, that the fact that Montgomery County had a time limit restriction and that the federal folks didn't have a time limit restriction. So in a lot of ways, Montgomery County policy was more restrictive than the federal policy in that sense. And that frankly can be explained by, administrative necessity, whether, where are the records, and, as Francisco said earlier, that it was largely paper driven. And so, now I think most of the police department's records are not paper driven, and, they're, computerized or digitized or whatever eyes you want to call it. And so the ability to actually accumulate and transmit the information necessary has now been made a little bit less less onerous because of the advent of widespread computers. I think that's a piece of this. That's one of the restrictions that that this bill seeks to eliminate.
I want to add Francisco, let me say this to what she just said. We did speak to some people at the people who would do the police, Montgomery County Police, who would carry out this task, and they did indicate that based on what you just said, Sherry, is that there would be more resources needed to conduct that task, by the way.
Yeah. So, and exactly. And Arthur, there would be, if the bill results as it's intended to result in more applications or more requests for certificates of helpfulness, then it's going to increase the workload of the people involved, and they will require more resources. I will note two things that are I think are important. One is that the bill, as it's written now, would require, at least that's my reading, I'm not a lawyer, that 4 specific requirements that MCPD has established be removed. And those have to do with the requirement that the qualifying crime occurred in Montgomery County, that the time requirement that you mentioned, Cherie, that officers from this agency, from MCPD, conducted an investigation, and that the case has not yet been prosecuted. All of these are more stringent than federal law requires, but they're not inconsistent with federal law, because the law, as it was written and intended, it gave the law enforcement agencies wide discretion as to whether even to make any certifications whatsoever, or what requirements to place on those certifications. So those are the 2 things that we need to keep in mind. And the fact is that because these 4 requirements are more stringent than what federal law requires, the bill would require that the 4 requirements be taken out.
So Francisco, sorry, let me raise. So Francisco, do we know how many of these U visas or how many of these certifications are issued by MCPD on an annual basis?
We were told about 200 a year.
Oh, 200 a year. Okay.
And also, I wanted to mention there are 2 things that also, in terms of the workload, that we should keep in mind. So there's likely to be an increase in applications. How big that increase is, it's difficult to tell for 2 reasons. The main requirement, that if it's removed, will likely bring more applicants is the time limits. But what other jurisdictions have seen over time is that most of the applications that they're getting are for, or most of the requests that they're getting are for crimes that took place months ago rather than years ago. Initially, it was years ago, but now over time, those applications, that population seems to have been reduced, and now it's mostly people who deal with crimes that took place months ago. The other thing to keep in mind is the increase in applications There has been since the law was passed in 2000, and regulations were established allowing for the U visa applications. It has the number of U visa applications has increased every year except for 3. And you can guess what those years were. Those were 2018, 2019, and 2020. And so I suspect that we will see something similar in the coming years under the new administration.
Yeah, can I just add that there's been some concern about increased costs. I'm assuming that there's been a fiscal impact note on this. Susan, do you know whether or not there's been a fiscal impact note? And if so, what it might say?
I haven't seen it yet. They have not scheduled the well, actually, let me check the packet for the public hearing tomorrow, but they're going to schedule the Public Safety Committee meeting sometime in the near future, and that's when they generally include the fiscal note. But let me check.
Yeah, and because I think, people are concerned about the fiscal impact, which I think is a legitimate concern, that'll, that may answer some of that uncertainty.
All right, so
Yep.
any other hands, Sonny?
Yeah, one other question related to any concern about fraud and abuse because of the increased applications? Because I know that Montgomery MCPD is already short-staffed, right? So
yeah, when you read the literature, there are concerns about fraud, in terms of MCPD, they either can certify or they can't. If they don't have the right information, if they cannot retrieve the right information, talk to the relevant people, then there's no way they can certify. So in terms of fraud, a fraud issue for MCPD, it's they can either say, I can certify or I can't. The question then becomes, so the cases of fraud that I've heard about are in applications that go to USCIS, and in cases in which people have falsified the certificates of helpfulness. And, I've worked non-immigrant visas at a U.S. consulate, and fraud was just a huge issue. So anytime that you involve visas, anything having to do with visas, there are issues with possible fraud.
All right, and anyone else? So what is the recommendation that we would like to make to the council? And thank you, Francisco and Arthur, for your hard work in the summaries. But we've heard some critical notes tonight. So what is the recommendation that we would like to make?
If the one very specific recommendation that I think makes sense is to add a sentence or two, whatever is needed, to make clear that MCPD policy, as it's now published, refers only to victims of crime, whereas the law applies to witnesses in under certain circumstances. And we think that the Montgomery Police policy should be adjusted to make sure that it allows for applications from witnesses, qualifying witnesses.
Okay.
And then I think we can send, I can write that sentence or two tonight, with Arthur, and send it to Susan and to you if everybody, assuming that folks have no other objections to the draft letter as it now stands.
All right, sounds good. Are there any other objections?
So is the motion to accept the draft that Francisco and Arthur sent with the amendment that we discussed? Is
No
that-
motion has been made yet, but you can make
Okay.
one, Terry.
there we go.
Okay.
A motion is to accept the draft letter that Francisco and Arthur put together on the U1 visas with the amendment as discussed, and that draft with the revisions be circulated. Can we finalize it tomorrow appropriately? Can we just do it as it is now? Susan, how do we do that?
You're going to have to vote on it tonight, I'm afraid, if you want me to send it out tomorrow, but you can vote for the amendment with the intent that you approve.
All right.
And
So-
I'm perfectly willing to make sure that Ms. Branson Cherie has a look-see at the to make sure that the language that we add is what she was concerned about.
All
Oh,
right.
you don't have to do that. I'm good with what you definitely understand where I'm going, so I'm good with it. Whatever you come up with, I'm willing to trust it.
Great.
So Susan, if we send this, is there a sense of urgency to send it tomorrow? Is the meeting tomorrow?
The public hearing is tomorrow, and I can send it to both the council members as well as the attorney for inclusion in the bill file.
Do I need to sign off on it, or can you just put,
You can just type the name.
all right, someone can type my name.
Yes.
Public, I give permission, please type my name.
Yes, and I'll copy everybody.
All right,
Yes.
thank you. So we have a motion. Do we have a second that we move our recommendation forward with the stated amendment?
I second that.
All right, so Sean has second. All in favor of moving our recommendation forward, say aye.
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 All opposed? Motion carried. And again, we want to thank you, Francisco and C. Arthur, for your very thorough summary and research and presentation for the council for this particular critical action. And we are hopeful, in the days to come for these communities. All right, we're moving now to public forums. We had some conversations in our last meeting that were a bit open-ended, and I believe there's a planning discussion that you were Mrs. Branson or Cherie, were you leading the subcommittee for
Sorry.
public forums?
Yeah, I was, but Susan and Logan sent some supplementary information about the scheduling and all that kind of stuff. We had already decided on broad topics.
Right.
And so really, I think all that's necessary is to, for Susan and Logan to actually book the room, so to speak. As I recall, the biggest thing was that there was a recommendation that we extend the, I think we had talked about having it in certain kind of facilities. And I think there was a recommendation that we extended to rec centers and libraries.
Right.
And I don't know if anybody has any, particular concern about that. I don't, but that seemed to be, the big deal.
That and the fact that hybrid is really difficult to do well. And so there were some logistical decision points for the commission to make. And you had originally wanted 2 meetings, one down in the Silver Spring area, one up in Gaithersburg. You've got the topics of conversation, which are great. I don't think NRPIO folks didn't think that the libraries may be big enough, so they suggested schools or rec centers, and they can book that if we can get approval from you and concept on that, and then to really try to avoid hybrid if possible. And so Logan had suggested two. Did you want to do both in person, both hybrid? Did you want to do one or the other? If you wanted to do just one that was in person, did you want to make it more centrally located in the county, like Rockville? So those are kind of more the decision points to make. And I'll cut and paste them from the email that I sent out.
Okay, so I have a question. If it is virtual, is that a public meeting? Because technically anyone can attend this meeting, right?
Yes. The difference would be is that this is where you ask the public to speak.
Okay.
So.
So when we discussed this last, I didn't know that that was an option. I think that there are some people, you know, in this climate, and if we're going to do one in the next 2 months, who would only attend virtually. So maybe we should consider doing one in person and one virtually. But that then leads us to decide where would the in-person meeting be. I think, you know, when we thought that both had to be public, we were saying that we want to go to different parts of the county. So we landed on Gaithersburg and Silver Spring. But maybe we could move to something more centrally located, or maybe even one of the county rooms, you know, if we're going to do one virtual or one public, and that would cut out several layers of complication. I'm sorry, Sonny and Cherie, which one of you raised your hands first?
I think it is Sherry. Sherry's.
So here's what I would, here's what I was going to recommend about the logistics. That, you know, January, February, well, January is really over by now, so we can't do one in January. But February becomes a little dicey because of, you know, weather. So if we wanted, so there's a couple of things. So if we wanted to go to March, I think that would make sense. If we don't want to go to March, then if we want to have one in February, I would highly recommend that one be virtual, just so that we don't have a snow date problem. I think we had, I think the requirement, for some reason in my head, I was thinking that August was the time by which we should have had two. Of course, that could just be something I made up in my head. But I thought that it was kind of linked to submission of the annual report. So my suggestion is as follows: that we consider, I understand the PIO's concern about doing something virtually, and so but I also understand that, you know, we've got a lot of people who may like to be there, who may like to participate, and so that they can speak, but who did not, who have not, who cannot, you know, have difficulty driving at night, or, you know, there's a whole lot of things that kind of keep people. Logan indicates that there's only one required per year. So anyway, I'm just all over the place. So I would suggest, you know, one of the things I thought we really wanted to get out to the public is an understanding of the new consent search policy. And so, you know, I would suggest that we do that sooner rather than later. And so if we could, you know, just sort of focus on finding a date, finding a place, so that people could actually weigh in on this consent search, traffic stop kind of thing.
Thank you. I agree with at least March, because that also gives us time to publicize, right? Sonny?
So I run a quarterly safety and security meeting for the District 1 and District 2, where the officials as well as MCPD attends the meeting. Around 70 to 80 people attend every quarter. What I've noticed is that, and we hold it at the Potomac Public Library. That's where because it's a central location for District 1 and District 2. What I've noticed is that we try doing hybrid meeting. It is logistically, it is very challenging. So I would recommend that either you do it as a online meeting or as a public meeting, right? In-person meeting. And people are very active, and you should expect a crowd, especially if you're doing for the whole county. I would expect a place that can hold more than 100 people would be what you should be thinking about, right? So, yeah.
Thank you. You make some good points. So so we're not voting yet. Let's take some polls to accumulate ideas toward a motion. All right. So I want to take a poll. Can we build a consensus around March being the time that we should hold the next forum? Would anyone disagree with that? So we have that nailed down. Should the forum be in person or virtual? I'd like in person, at least for our first one. But again, it's still March, and this is a crazy winter. Are you all aware that there's another polar vortex that's coming in a week or so? So I don't know what Mark is going to hold. Christina?
Yes, to answer that question, I would want to know if we plan on doing 1 or 2 meetings.
I think we can do 2. What are your thoughts? Is there consensus around that? Would anyone object to trying to do 2?
And if it is 2, then I would say 1 virtual, 1 in person.
All right. So Susan is saying if we do, so go ahead and use your words, Susan.
No, if you wanted to do the in-person one in the winter, we can have a published rain date as well. If you want to hold the virtual one to avoid any bad weather situation, you can do that and wait a little bit later in the spring for the in-person. Okay, so if we're going to do 2, I think it makes sense to do the virtual meeting during the winter months.
Mhm.
Does everyone agree with that?
Agree.
So March, then we're looking at virtual, which then handles the venue. We just have to look at the specific date. Would we do it at the same time as our meeting? So is it like, an ACP meeting that we then open to the public to address certain issues? So during our March meeting time, which would be the second Monday in March,
Right.
we're going to look to make that a public meeting. That will be virtual. So the last piece is agenda. So Cherie says that we need to discuss, excuse me. Cherie, state that again. I'm sorry, it was the stop and frisk.
It was the Montgomery County Police changed their consent search policy. I think it's important to, for people to understand that and have it out there. And to be honest with you, I can't remember what the other topics are. I have to actually move in order to find them.
That's fine. So I'm only asking for publicity because I'm thinking, Susan and Logan, in advertising the meeting, wouldn't we say we will discuss in broad terms, ABC topics, right? So we need to know what, but we don't have, we've had some previous discussions. Cherie, if you can send that back to us, or perhaps it's in the minutes, Susan and Logan, if we can pull that out by, do we need to nail that down now so that we can start to advertise? Because we have a date, we have a venue. And obviously, if we're not married to only stick to 2 topics, right? If other things come out, but I think the major topics we want to discuss, we want to highlight in our publicity. Francisco.
Yeah. One of the questions that I think we should be asking at every public meeting is, what are the major concerns? And I think that's important. However, I also want to we need to figure out how to formulate, and the folks who have done this before can probably help us to make sure that it's, to ideally what we get is a sense of major concerns about public safety, rather than just complaining about whatever bothers somebody on that particular day.
Right. That's important. So your experience is that most of the questions are around public safety?
I'm sorry. No, no, I just, that there, I think it was, someone at a previous meeting mentioned that we need to, structure the meetings in a
Yes.
way that it doesn't become just a gripe session. I mean,
Right.
yeah.
No, oh, I agree with that. Sherry, oh.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it just flew right out of my head. What I was gonna say.
Well, Sherry, let's wait for it to fly back, and while it's doing that,
Yeah,
we'll go to
exactly.
Arthur. All right, it's gonna come back. All right, Arthur.
Oh, I just wanted to add about trying to eliminate the gripe session is whether we can write out the questions on a form, a piece of paper, whatever, before and pass out when people come in, and to suggest this is the structure that we would like to move with.
I think that would be very important to do, Arthur. Thank you. And it'll help if we have particular topics, right, to kind of guide the discussion. John, and then back to Sherry.
Yeah, my question is, we'll have somebody facilitating, correct? That will,
Yes.
and it'll be through Zoom like this.
Yeah, Susan is nodding
No,
her head.
it's my understanding that Logan and I can be the facilitators unless somebody from the commission wants to do it.
I think you guys would do such a fabulous job.
It's
and you know, we really believe in you.
one of the tricks is either posting microphones on a stand, or we hold the microphones and don't give it to the speaker. Otherwise, sometimes they like to monopolize the entire conversation. So,
I was going to suggest something like that live, doing things, especially we have, and Pastor, Bradley, you probably can attest to this. If you have a meeting at church and people ramble, if you hold the mic, it's easier to take it, snatch it back than take it out of somebody's hand. But I was thinking virtually was where I was thinking as far as the facilitation. When we do it virtually, how would that play out and who would do it? And then also, I think I brought this up early on about the migrating Facebook. There's a way to migrate Facebook with Zoom. We've done it with the city of Gaithersburg, and we got a lot of engagement when people are on social media. They may not join the Zoom, but it migrates in well with Facebook, and then whoever's facilitating has to catch the questions that are in the comments as well as Zoom. And I think, Susan, we had talked about it, and you had to look into, I guess, the county policy regarding social media, but I know we do have a social media page.
You know, I'm sorry, John, did I cut you off?
No, go ahead.
Because you got me thinking. I'm wondering if we could have people submit questions to the chat, and then we can be selective about what questions fit. My only concern is if that's ableist. Like, is everyone able to type a question in the chat?
I don't think they can unless it's enabled through Zoom. Whoever is controlling the presentation, like of this meeting, they have to give the rights to the public to ask the questions, and then somebody would have to filter through those, and then whoever the facilitator is probably could read those questions. And maybe, I guess we have housekeeping rules in the beginning to let everybody know not everybody's questions, just so it's fair. But because people will ask, my question to get asked you, and you don't want to offend anybody, but I think to plan out how we would do it virtually is very key, especially if we're going to do it again and you want people to advertise for you, say, hey, this is a good meeting, you guys want to join, just so that we can get the participation and get as much back from the public as possible.
Thanks, John. That makes a lot of sense. Just before we go to Christina and Sherry, Susan posted that we could also have people ask their questions ahead of time. And then it can be built into the agenda where I guess it fits the major topics that we want to raise. Okay, Christina, then Sherry.
Yes, I was just going to ask Sunny, you mentioned the amount of turnout we should expect to use the library space in that consideration. Have you had experience with virtual meetings of the same sort? And have you had the similar turnout?
Generally, the virtual meetings are much more attended, but we haven't had a virtual meeting. All our meetings were in person.
Thank you.
All right, Cherie.
Yeah, thank you. It did in fact fly back in. So I think what the other thing we have to decide on is the time. What time frame are we talking about? You know, because that will help craft the programming, right? I mean, if we're talking about 1 hour, then really consent searches and traffic stuff is probably all we're going to be able to do. But if we're talking about 2 hours, then we could potentially move into, you know, some other topic. So I don't know if we had made a decision about time per se, or the duration of the meeting, I should say. But I'm suggesting that we also, you know, do that.
So I like 2 hours for the reasons that you stated. And I also think that we should start a little later than we normally would for people who work and have a busy home life. Like I have to feed kids at 6, and so my wife knows to help during this day, right? So maybe 7 to 9.
Yeah, that's fine with me. I just think we should, you know, we should definitely sort of nail that down before we get to, you know, a publication thing.
All right, so any dissent to that? Does anyone have a different idea? All right, so far we got March 10th, 7 to 9 p.m. We're on Zoom. We have the county consent policy. What did you say about traffic, Cherie? Was that all one policy? It was 2.
I think traffic, like an update on traffic enforcement. Because, you know, there had been some, you know, this commission did a report on that, and I think, you know, there were some changes to that. So it might be good for people to, you know, understand, you know, whether traffic enforcement, like for instance, one of the things I think they're doing now, they weren't necessarily doing at the same at the same volume, is that now they're giving more warnings as opposed to tickets when they stop people for like your tail lights out or whatever. And so, you know, it could be, I think it would be good to actually hear from the police about that. And as we're making these decisions about dates, we do have to get buy-in from the police that like they'll be there. And those are dates that they can meet, you know.
That is true. That is true. All right, so we have, you know, these 2 topics. You know, so I recommend that we spend an hour on 2 topics and then an hour or so taking questions from the public. Does that make sense to everyone? So Cherie highlighted these 2 topics. You know, I especially agree on the consent policy. Are we okay with advertising these 2 topics, or is there another topic any of you think we should switch out? Because if not,
I want to be sure what 2 topics are we talking about? Consent to search and traffic. What were the 2 topics?
An update on traffic enforcement. Cherie, do you want to say a little more again for John?
Yeah, sorry, I'm moving around. The OLO, as well as the Office of Legislative Oversight, as well as this commission, published reports on racial disparities in traffic enforcement. And I'm told that there were certain policy changes, like, you know, like giving people warnings instead of tickets when you're stopped for like, you know, your tail lights out, that kind of thing. So it would be good to have an update on, you know, whether those racial disparities are continuing, what other sort of maybe geographical focuses on traffic enforcement are
Mm.
occurring. You know, and the rationale underlying those decisions. I think in our report, we took issue with some of the locations where there were high levels of enforcement activity,
Right.
because those locations were also in certain in areas that were disproportionately Black or brown. We also and I think you know, the police response was that this was a safety thing. And so we sort of had a disagreement about whether those safety concerns were then being used in a way that that would actually improve the safety of pedestrians and drivers, you know. So and what the Insurance Institute, you know, says about those locations, whether those locations are more likely to be unsafe. So that's, you know, so it was, I assume that report is still on our website. People might want to take a look at it, because it was very it was sort of wide ranging and stuff, you know, that had to do with traffic. So and frankly, most people who come in contact with the police on just an everyday kind of basis, it's usually because somebody's pulled you over and is going to give you a ticket, or you think they're going to give you a ticket. So, you know, and the police have their reasons. I mean, I don't want to keep going on, but anyway, traffic enforcement tends to be a rather hot button issue. and so, and that's why it would be good to sort of marry it with the consent search stuff. Because, you know, one of the things you may be asked if you're pulled over is whether or not they can search your vehicle, you know? So all that kind of, you know, feeds together. So anyway, I hope that answered your question, or I could just keep rambling until I hit on something. I don't know.
No,
I
you're
agree
good.
with everything that you just said, Sherry. So thank you for all of that.
I have a question. So the first hour of this meeting is our plan to hear from the police and elected officials, or what is the plan for the first hour for these two topics before we accept questions?
Right. So if we agree on these two topics, we would hear Susan and Logan for someone from the department who could address the issues authoritatively.
I can definitely ask them.
Right. Sonny, what are you thinking?
So we every coin has two sides, right? So we need to understand from the police side too. So if we are going to have a discussion, if we want to have a productive discussion about these topics, I think we should include the police chiefs and hear where they are coming from, right?
Yeah.
So that is what I was thinking. So we can dedicate some time to them, and we can also hear from the elected officials too, right? So if we can, if somebody from the county council, typically in our meeting, President Fritzen attends our meeting so we have Fritzen there along with the police chiefs. So when the people are able to ask the questions, and they're able to answer specific questions related to safety and health issues.
So I'm wondering, Susan, and who are the county council members that are most closely connected to the consent policy?
Well, that would be members of the Public Safety Committee, and Sydney Katz is the chair. You also have council members Kristen Mink and Dawn Ludke. There's the council president, Kate Stewart, and the council vice president, Will Jawando.
Well, you just named all of them, so.
Well, 5 of them, not quite all, but yeah.
All right, so I think to Sonny's point, we probably should invite a council person who's closely affiliated with the consent policy, right? Christy?
I was just gonna say, if we are gonna cover traffic, we should also probably at least put out an invite to MCDOT.
I think we're gonna need a third hour. I don't know. But you're right. Okay.
I'm gonna say we should not do a third hour.
Okay, so let's do this first. Are we locked in on the 2 topics being, do we want to have 2 topics? It sounds like either one topic would fill the hour.
Yeah. I'm thinking like 2 topics is way too much because knowing from my past meeting, it depends upon how many people attend these meetings. So maybe we pick one topic first.
Yeah.
As a trial.
I think I agree with that. Actually, because
I think we should go with the consent search as a first topic, given that we had a public meeting on traffic. Just given the importance around some of the consent search work.
Yeah. Eva, then John.
I agree. We should focus on the consent searches. I think we talked about that last meeting. It's also a pressing issue as the new MCPD policy has just gone into effect. I would advocate for having that be the sole focus of the meeting, because the longer the meeting is, the less likely people are to turn out, or the more likely they are to turn up late or leave early and be otherwise disruptive.
Yeah.
This further emphasizes the importance of us having 2 meetings. And I think it's a great idea for us to have 2 public meetings, but to start with, making it virtual, making it about the consent searches is gonna get, I think, the broadest public buy-in from a variety of different folks, especially from young folks.
Okay, thanks, Eva. John?
Which is almost verbatim what she said. I think that, especially if it's going to be virtual, the first one's going to be virtual, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yes.
That's what we agreed. And the consent to search definitely is going to draw a younger crowd to want to engage if it's put out in those places where they know this is going on. They can ask those questions, and then it would advertise the next meeting. And if we give what we're going to talk about in the next meeting at the first one, then when we have it in person, you're more likely to see more people, in my opinion, show up for that, especially for that topic as well.
All right, so let's take a poll. Please raise your hands if you support focusing on the consent policy. All right, so that's the majority. I can't see the rest of you with your screens off, but we have the majority. So that's great. So that then helps for advertising. So we are going to have the ACP is going to have a public forum to address the county's new consent policy. Who are we inviting to lead the discussion? So we have the various council persons that Susan shared. So I guess see who has the most passion in it and is also available and willing, or how should we do that?
I think I would just recommend that the ACP leads the discussion. Either choose to look at it as an educational opportunity to educate the public and invite your invited guests to speak to that, or also look at it to seek public input. That could be the question period. So.
Well, but it has passed, right?
Yes.
So what input are people going to have at this point?
It's not completely accurate to say it has passed because it's not a law. It's just it's that MCPD has changed its own internal policy, right? Mm-hmm. So there was a law, it was a bill that would have affected consent searches and how they're conducted. But that bill was in the last session. So unless they reintroduce it, I guess. I don't know. I forget when. Yeah. So that bill, I think, is almost off the table because of the implementation, because the police have agreed to change their consent search policy. So, and I say all that to say that I think the folks who need to be there to talk about it, other than this commission, are the chief of police. And I think it would be good to have the council president. Because, you know, if public, if the public feeling is that the consent search policy, the new consent search policy, is either too much or not enough or whatever, you know, I think the council and legislation is still, people feel legislation is still necessary, that the council president should be the one who hears those things. That's my 2 cents.
But somebody, somebody else is.
Okay, wait,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Arthur has his hand up. Then Sonny. Christy, is your hand up from the last time, or is it up anew?
It's just leftover, sorry.
All right, Arthur.
Well, my 2 cents about what congressperson should be there is Jawando, because I think because he the one who put the bill through in the first that didn't go through, and he also appeared before this commission, and he seemed to be the most, to me, the most one passionate about it. I would want to see what he has to say or how he feels about this within the realms of this meeting that we're going to have.
Okay, duly noted. Sonny.
I think I was about to say the same thing. So whoever was pushing for the bill should be the one who should be presenting it to the people, because he is most aware and most passionate about this thing, right? So we'll hear from both sides of the thing. While council president is future looking at things, but I think the person to explain the bill would be council member Jawando, right? Did I get that correctly? Yes.
All right. Francisco.
Yes, my 2 cents is that we need to get somebody from MCPD to explain the policy. Ideally, the chief of police. If he can't, someone else. In terms of who should attend from the council, if we can get council member Jawando to attend, great. If not, someone else will be fine. But you know, we may get into scheduling issues, and so we may need to be a little bit flexible on that. But the critical thing is we need someone from NCPD to explain the policy, the new policy, to the public. And I think it's a great opportunity for them to explain the rationale and also how they're going to implement it.
Right. So I agree with that too. You know, I mean, we more so than us giving a report, because there's some questions that we cannot answer authoritatively, right? On behalf of the police department. So let's take a poll. First, are we all in agreement that we need to extend an invitation to the chief of police so that he or someone that from the department he designates explain the new policy? If you're in agreement with that, raise your hands that at least that person should be there. All right. So that looks like the majority. And again, we're just doing a poll toward making a motion, right? We have a lot of data. Then we need to talk about the council. So Cherie recommends the president of the council. Then others of you say council person Jawando, because he initiated the bill. I just want someone from the council to be there because I'm concerned about schedule. So to whom should we send an invitation? Raise your hands. I'll ask about the president since he came forward first, or his name came forward first. Should we invite the president of the council to come first? Raise your hands if you're in support of that.
The president of the council is a woman.
Excuse me. Excuse me. All right. Get me. All right. So should we invite should we send an invitation to her should we extend an invitation to the president of the council? We'll leave gender out of it to come and to share. Raise your hands if so, if you agree with that. So let's see, 1, 2. So that's 3. All right. Should we extend the invitation to Councilperson Jawando? Raise your hands. All right, 1. So that's the majority. So Susan, Logan, will you please get in touch with the chief and ask him to come. He's invited, but if not, ask him to send an officer who can come and explain the new consent policy. And then we'll extend an invitation to Councilperson Jawando to come. And if he cannot come, then let's move up to the president and see if she can come. But we want someone who has worked on that policy from the council to represent the council, I think is the main idea. Eva?
Yeah, I just wanted to also propose that we invite the chair of the Public Safety Committee. That was Councilmember Katz, not sure who it is now, but that person should be there so that they can hear firsthand what citizens are saying.
All right, I'm seeing a lot of head shaking. So in a Baptist church, that's the equivalent of an amen. So I'm assuming that we're all okay with Mr. Katz coming. All right, so can we extend that invitation as well? Is there anyone else who needs to be there? Now, let me pause. Christy, I'm coming to you. So when I'm thinking when we're inviting these people, we're expecting them to speak on the subject, right? So do we need to make that clear? So we know we want the police representative or the chief or his representative to speak on the subject, and we want the council person to speak. Are we inviting Mr. Katz also to do the same, or just to be there in case there are any questions, or just because of the role that he plays on the council? Eva?
I would like him to just listen, but
okay,
if he wants to talk about his role in converting the Freedom to Leave Act effort into an MCPD policy, because it seemed like he did have some role in that, it would be helpful for folks to hear, I think.
Okay, so Susan, let him. We'll give him we'll give the lion's share to the first 2, but let him know we might just want him to share a bit of that.
Could I go through a list of bullet points of what you have all, I think, agreed on and get a formal vote for it?
No, so I will do that as moderator. Okay. I'm still collecting data, but thank you. All right, Christy, did you want to have what else?
I was just wondering, like, I understand we should give explicit invitations for those that we want to speak, but I mean, we should be extending the invitation to all of the council members, shouldn't we?
That's going to create a forum issue.
Okay, I see.
I mean, which could be fine. I just have to make sure that it gets advertised appropriately through council channels and not just ACP channels. But yeah.
All right, so in preparation for a motion, we have our public meeting date for March 10th with a time of 7/9 with the venue being Zoom. We're going to focus on the county's new consent policy. To speak on the policy, we are inviting the chief of police or his designee, Councilperson Jawando, and if he's not able to make it, another council person who has worked on the policy. Am I leaving anything out, Susan?
Nope.
All right, Francisco and Logan.
I'm sorry, I think this is a clarification. There was some discussion about inviting Chair Katz as well.
Right. And Chair Katz. All right. So again, March 10th, this is our public meeting, March 10th, 7 to 9 p.m. The venue is Zoom. The focus is the county's new consent policy. We're inviting the chief of police or his designee, Councilperson Jawando, or another council person if he's unable to attend, and Council person Katz.
Do we want to fix the date based on the invitees' availability rather than us deciding the date of March 10th? Because We generally do it the other way. So we decide, okay, these are the people that we want to invite. And what is the date? We say that generally the first or second week of March. And then, yeah.
So I think that we should stick with this date just so that we give them a time frame to work with, especially since we're leaving it fairly open, right? So we have, if the chief of police can't attend, someone else who can speak to the policy. I'm sure he'll send a good person. And then we have some options with the council, and we're 2 months out, and this is our first public hearing. So I'm hoping they'll make it a priority. So I think we're safe with the 10th. If we can't get anyone to come, Logan and Susan, let us know right away.
Yeah.
And we'll do an email scramble to change plans. All right. But can we get a motion on the stated plans that we've continued to poll tonight? And that is that we will have our first public meeting at March the 10th from 7 to 9 on Zoom to discuss county consent, inviting the chief of police or his designee, Councilperson Jawando, or another councilperson affiliated with the consent policy, and Chairman Katz. All right, so we got a motion from Francisco. Do we have a second? All right.
Second.
All right. All in favor, say aye or raise your hands.
Aye.
Any opposition? All right, motion carried. I'm so excited. Can't wait until March. I'm going to get a new outfit. All right. So, new business. Is there any new business?
Wait, just one thing before we move forward. And that is, in the past, our challenge has been getting out the word of our public meetings. And so, would it be possible to have, from Susan and Logan, whatever outlets they're going to use to get out the words? I mean, not right now, but maybe by our next meeting, they could, provide us with that, so that, if we have any supplements or whatever, for publicity, then, because I think a big part of this is not having, is making sure we have a good cross section of the community.
Right. Yeah. All right. So how soon can we have, I guess, a flyer or a notice put together? I guess it's pending our invitees, responding to the invitation.
Yes, if you want them listed in the press release, our public information office usually puts that together. And we've got several from prior years' public forums that we can map off of. The public information office does have a list of people that they send out press releases to, which includes all the local newspapers, and puts it on social media. And council members also advertise through their own social media as well as their own weekly newsletters generally.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sounds good. But if we, as you send it to us, we can send it also to our other community groups.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Okay. John, then Christina.
That was my question. Will there be some kind of way we can, what should we ask? I just want to be sure I want to make sure I got a copy of it, so I can share it and make sure that the communities that I work with are aware that we're having this, and the link as well.
Yes.
Yeah. That's great. Christina.
Yes, so although we are not inviting all the council members, what you just mentioned, Susan, about the council members putting this type of information in their newsletters, will we need to ask all of them to put that in their newsletter, or will that be is that like the standard?
I can't say, I mean, they can do whatever they want with their newsletters. I always share information with them and, offer to, put it in a format that they can include, and we'll absolutely do that this time too.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to make sure it was like an explicit, we really want you to put this in your newsletter.
Yes,
we want your people to come.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yes, and the more that you all as a commission can share with your networks, the better as well. So.
Thank you.
Okay, Logan.
Thank you. Just a point of order before the vote to adjourn after any other new business. Henry pointed out, I think correctly at the beginning of the meeting, technically the minutes that the commission voted on should be for November, since the December meeting was the training. So just as a formality, it might be helpful to just revote to approve the November minutes instead of December at some point.
Thank you very much. So we approved minutes that did not happen, apparently. So let's go back. Can we have a motion to approve the minutes from the November meeting?
I'll move to approve.
I move.
All
And I
right.
second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 All right. Thank you. The November minutes are now legitimate. All right. Any new business? Terry? Terry, you're muted still.
Sorry, I just want to ask Susan and Logan and folks that have done this before, what's a reasonable time frame to wait for an answer from the council folks as well as?
I was going to say, police will probably answer pretty quickly. I'll have to check with the schedulers in the council member offices. I hope I can get something by this week, at least a tentative.
Okay.
So.
All right. That's always just wondering in the invitation if we give them a deadline. I don't want to poke the bear, but also I want to be mindful that you have to do the public announcement and advertise. So the balance there. So thank you. No new business. That was my question.
Okay. You know, we're covering such a critical topic that I'm hoping that we don't have to chase people, but we'll see. All right. Any new business? Any other new business going once?
Only thing is it's the budget. So Susan, did you I think you may have sent out a budget update or something, or not?
Not budget.
Not budget. Okay. So it is anticipated. When is the budget? When will the agency submit their thing to the county executive? Not until March, right?
Well, we get it from the county executive on March 15th. They're going through that process now of the puts and takes and what the executive will push across the street. So.
And so between now and then, is there any I guess what I'm interested in is for us to ask ourselves whether there's anything that we would like, this commission would like to sort of suggest or downplay or ask them to think about in the budget for our February meeting. I guess that's the new business that I'm suggesting that we undertake, if that makes sense.
It does. All right, so we'll add that to the agenda for February. And if there's any data we can get ahead of time, that would be great.
I will send you my budget report from May 6th, which is what finalized their FY25 budget. They've not had any supplemental appropriations since then, and I'll see what other kind of salient work sessions they've had since then, and I can send those your way as well. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Francisco. You're muted, Francisco.
There we go. I hope that not necessarily, the next time we meet, but at some time in the future, we invite Chief Yamada to come and talk to us. And I would like to suggest a topic, particularly from him or one of his representatives. There has been a lot of talk about the shortage of police officers and the concerns that we're not able to keep up to fill existing positions. And I think that would be a useful topic for us to look into and to get briefings, especially from MCPD, and what are their views and what are their vision for filling in those empty positions.
Okay. Very good. I agree. That would be a very critical thing for us to discuss. So if we can add that to a future topic. And we have not yet met with the new chief, have we, in this forum? So it would be nice to invite him to a future meeting fairly soon. All right, is there any other new business? Going once, going twice. All right, well, thank you all for another good meeting. Can we get a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
I second.
All right, we got a motion from John and a second from Christina to adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
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 All
Aye.
opposed, if you oppose, you can stay on the link. All right, everyone, have a good evening.
Happy New Year to everyone.
Thank you.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.
All right, take care.